Welcome to our DW Business Special, looking at how businesses are skirting Western sanctions and providing Russia with key material for its war in Ukraine. I'm Stephen Beardsley in Berlin, and I'm joined today by Naomi Garcia. She's an analyst with nonprofit C4ADS out of Washington, D.C., and she's been tracking imports into Russia. Naomi, before we get into the details, a quick question for an overview. The EU, the U.S., other nations claimed at the beginning of this war that their sanctions would choke off imports of materials into Russia. Again, we'll get into the details shortly, but briefly, what story does the data that you've been looking at tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. The data that we have collected reveals that these exports of dual-use technologies, sensitive goods to Russia, have not stopped in any way, and that the sanctions are not able to fully blockade that. And actually what we've seen is an increase in dual-use shipments and military applicable goods to Russia since the start of the war and about 6 months preceding the start of the war.
All right, we'll take a closer look at all of that in just a moment. Let's look first at the context around this topic. Now, companies aiding the Russian military, despite Western sanctions, is a growing concern for the U.S., the EU, and their allies. The G7 is reportedly now discussing further sanctions on Chinese companies for supplying that non-lethal aid to Russia. Now, looking back, Russia and China, of course, had declared a no-limits partnership in the lead-up to Russia's war. Biden was said to have warned Xi Jinping several times in phone calls since the war began about providing material support to Russia. In June, the U.S. sanctioned 5 Chinese companies, but in September, Biden said there was no evidence of China providing weapons to Russia. All right, let's go back to Naomi. Naomi, your focus is on the exports of Chinese state-owned companies, particularly those of a defensive conglomerate called Poly Group. And if I'm getting this right, it's sub-company Poly Technology. This can all be a little confusing. Maybe you can help us understand what you're looking for in your research.
Absolutely. I started my research investigating the Poly Group conglomerate, which is a large state-owned Chinese defense network of companies, and they operate directly under China's state-owned Assets Commission, SASC. We see almost 2,000 companies that operate within the Poly Group network that are all kind of running from different directions from state mandates. And what we see is multiple of these companies have shipped very similar exports to the same sanctioned Russian defense companies, the same companies in Russia that are currently operating in Ukraine. We see dual-use parts not only pertaining to particular electronics and machinery, but also really explicit parts. Some of our shipments in the trade data that I'm sure we'll get into explicitly say that these shipments from Chinese defense conglomerates, state-owned companies, are specifically for the use of M171 helicopters and or S-400 systems, both of which Russia has been recorded using in its current invasion of Ukraine.
When we're talking about these companies, what can be a little confusing here is, if I understand this right, these conglomerates contain companies that, in theory, at least on the label, some of them are military related and some of them may not be. Does that make analyzing them a lot more difficult?
Absolutely. That really is one of the first steps in understanding the China space, is recognizing that the complexity of these organizations can really obfuscate a lot of these illicit networks and shipments that we're seeing in trade data. One of our focuses has been to use a more novel methodology to understand these chains. And what we did in a report that we published in July called Trade Secrets is used what we call overlapping leadership methodology to identify and then detect companies that are operating within the Poly Group, sending similar illicit shipments. So what I mean by that is we were able to collect information on the current and former employees for the company Poly Technologies who I identified in trade data. And then we went back through Chinese corporate registries and identified companies that those exact same individuals had worked at. Using this overlapping and shared leadership methodology, we were able to identify multiple other Poly Technology subsidiaries who were sending the same exact goods.
So if I understand this right, then that may mean that you have multiple companies. Not all of them may have perfect descriptors of what they're doing, but you can look at the individuals connected to the companies and then make an inference that they are engaged in the same business. Is that about correct?
Absolutely, and we've seen that to be really effective. After identifying two companies that seemed high risk based on shared leadership with Poly Technologies, we dug in a little more and found out that they were actually majority owned by Poly Technologies, and found virtually identical defense shipments to the same Russian sanctioned defense companies. And this is something that we really focus on because, as you've mentioned, it is really complex to identify what companies operate in these illicit networks. And we've seen many trends of Chinese, and not only Chinese, but international companies being sanctioned for illicit defense networks, simply changing the name of their company or deregistering it and starting another company under the exact same group. And so by using the shared leadership methodology, we can really see pretty simply who has transitioned from a company that was shut down, maybe in relation to sanctions, who then went to another company in the same group that's likely performing the same operations.
This is, when you look at your report from July, when you look at, for example, some of this data, I believe your organization gave to the Wall Street Journal. They combed through it as well for a recent article. It's a tremendous amount of data. And I think any viewer or reader would wonder, where does it come from? Is this public data? Was this purchased? Is this leaked data? How would you describe it?
Our data comes from so many different sources, and yes, we are very proud of it. We now maintain almost 1.5 billion global trade records, which I have cleaned and put all in one place so we can all search it. And yeah, you're right, we partner with other organizations to make that openly accessible. The data itself comes from a variety of different sources. We start largely with authoritative sources who publicly publish their jurisdiction's trade. And then also we supplement that with third-party trade sources and other things that we're finding in open sources. At this point, with our 1.5 billion records, it's very easy for us to vet a new source, wash it against the holdings that we do have and have already confirmed are accurate, and then determine that the source itself is ready to go.
You just touched on this a little bit ago, but is the data difficult because of the scale of it in one sense, or is it because it's incomplete, or just a combination of both?
Both, all of the above. What really makes trade data the most complex is that every jurisdiction in the world has its own specific reporting mechanism and requirements for its customs authorities and the trade that comes in and out of it. These are nowhere near the same for any jurisdiction. So some countries don't report their trade at all. Some countries report only a very small component part of their trade data. China, for example, doesn't report its trade data at all, but it used to in about 2018. And during that time, it mostly omitted the names of foreign recipient companies, which led analysis to be pretty difficult. And the other thing about trade data that is so complex is that these are all written in local languages, and they're really just ripe with human input errors, misspellings, company name variations, things like that. So a lot of our process is going through and using some sophisticated models like fuzzy matching to make sure all of these names, all of these company names can be aggregated to the same, so we can really do these massive build-outs that we're doing of what companies are participating in which illicit networks.
Okay, I want to get a little bit more specific. I want to bring up several examples of the kind of equipment that companies are providing. You already touched on this earlier. Let's bring up two. First, an October shipment from Chinese firm China Tally Aviation Technology Corps to Russian firm Almaz Anti for radar parts for the S-400 anti-aircraft system. Now, that specific instance was detailed in that Wall Street Journal article I mentioned earlier, based on data from your organization. Another example, multiple shipments of parts for Russia's M-system helicopters made between June and November of 2022. Now, all of these shipments taking place, of course, after the war began in late February. The seller in that case, the last case I mentioned, was Poly Technologies. The buyer was Ulan Uda. Now, Naomi, these items that you're tracing, you've said dual use several times, and I mentioned, of course, that Biden said that he didn't believe that there were weapons that were being sold to the Russians from China. How would you describe this? Are these military materials? Are they dual use in the sense that they could be used for both sides, or what do we see?
Absolutely. These are definitely military applicable materials. And so when I say that, what I mean is, as you noted before, the trade data itself is complex, and there's no way that I, as a researcher, can perfectly confirm that this shipment was used exactly in this way. But I can report on exactly what the data says. And the data for those shipments, starting even right before the war on January 14, 2022. We see a shipment from Poly Technologies that is explicitly listed as radar parts for the S-400 system sent to Almazante, who then just 6 weeks later was using the S-400 system in the invasion of Ukraine. We similarly see, I think it's, 13 shipments from Poly Technologies after the start of the war in February 2022. 13 shipments after the start of the war of exports that were explicitly labeled were for the use of the M171 helicopter system. And those include dual-use goods like engine parts. There were some oil tanks, some pumps, and then really importantly, there were some radio receivers for telecommunications. We call these dual-use goods because in a different context, it isn't necessarily militarily applicable to send a pump, right? So I just always want to make that caveat. But what we see is we have these, Chinese state-owned defense companies sending the exact same parts that Russia's using in the war in Ukraine to Russia's sanctioned defense companies. And so it is a pretty clear understanding that this trade flow exists.
If you look at the data, because many of these companies had relationships with the Russian military industry before the war began, they were already making shipments. If you look at the data, do you see a change in shipments after the war began and after sanctions were announced? That is, did you see maybe a pause? Did you see an increase? Did things remain the same? Was there any sort of reaction?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to speak more specifically to the companies that I'm aware of, because, again, global trade data is not comprehensive, and that's part of what makes it so interesting to investigate. It's really just identifying these leads in this massive database. And so what I've identified from the companies that I've been researching is actually an increase in military applicable parts that are explicitly labeled for military systems to Russia from China since the start of the war, and even for a couple months preceding the war. We see about a 300% increase in M171 system parts from Poly Technologies to these Russian defense companies just about a month or two before the invasion started. And most of those shipments are actually during the war itself.
Well, the teeth in these sanctions is supposed to be that it prohibits these businesses from then doing business with Western companies or using Western avenues of business. Do we know the extent to which these firms that you've found are doing business with Russia and Russia's military, do we know the extent to which they're doing business with Western companies as well, who could then get into trouble for working with them?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So even a step like a little bit closer than that, what we see is Poly Technologies itself and these other defense companies that operate in these networks, even just starting with their own shipments, we see about, I think, almost 100 Western touching shipments from these companies beginning in 2018. And that could include exporting to a Western country, importing directly from a Western country, or shipments that are labeled with a country of origin in a Western country. So that means that it's initially manufactured somewhere, is then transshipped through another country, and then sent further. So we can actually dig in pretty deeply and see that these companies themselves have direct ties to Western entities. And also, our data allows us to really at scale build out these networks rapidly. And so what I've done is gone one level further and looked at specifically Poly Technologies and other entities, but I'll talk about Poly Technologies now, specifically their trade partners who they've directly traded with, and then looked at all of the global shipments for all of those trade partners that they have operated with. And we see about 30% of Poly Technologies trade partners have active Western ties in their shipments, either exporting, importing, or countries of origin. And this is really impactful because, as you mentioned, sanctions measures specifically stipulate that any entity who's trading goods or services or even financially supporting these sanctioned Russian defense companies is potentially at risk for sanctions penalties as well, even if that entity isn't aware that they're engaging in these supply chains, and even if it wasn't a direct shipment. So a company that is found out to have indirectly transferred parts to one of these Chinese defense companies who then sends them to Russia, we've seen multiple cases of actual sanctions measures being enforced for those entities, even if they didn't know what they were doing. So part of our aim is to just get that message out there that this really is a high risk.
how difficult does these Chinese business structures, when you look at Poly Group, Poly Technology, you spend all of your time trying to figure out what company belongs to what, which executives are actually on which boards, or which ones are tied to which. It must be incredibly hard for a Western business then to be able to puzzle that out as well, and to know that the business that they're doing trade with is actually connected. Is that sort of the greater point of this as well, is that it's going to be incredibly difficult for these companies?
Absolutely. It really is. And that is the role that we hope to play. We really want to obviously support the international effort for global security. And we publish free open source reports. I have another one coming out in just about a month. And my goal is to include multiple prominent Russian defense companies that do have ties both to the West and to Poly Technologies. And the report in July also includes a table of companies that we've seen prominently interacting in this space. And so hopefully, as we continue to build this up, we're going to put those names out there and make it a lot easier for the international community to vet their supply chains.
You're working with a lot of data that to a great extent is publicly available, or at least you can get access to it. To what extent can you determine if there's an active attempt or effort to really be evasive from these companies, or is it just through sheer scale, there's the assumption that their activities won't be seen, or is there just a lack of concern that these companies are going to do business and they're not going to really care what the outcome is? How do you, when you're looking through the data, how do you sort of interpret that?
That's a fantastic question. It's really interesting to be in this space right now, because I want to spread the word that we have this data set now and we are capable of providing this analysis. And at the same time, I recognize that publicizing it really does send a message that this data is ripe for understanding these illicit trends. And we haven't seen a decrease in reported military use shipments, but also this is really kind of a new methodology, and previously no real centralized, harmonized global trade database has existed as a free text search for public access. And so as we build this up, we're really excited to get the message out there, but also do recognize that by spreading the word, it's a possibility that we'll see a decrease in reported shipments. Up to this point, there really hasn't been a ton of specific obfuscation of exact, companies are sending certain things to other sanctioned companies. But what we do see happen often is entities almost consistently misreport their HS codes. And so HS codes are harmonized system codes. They're international. They're mostly 6-digit codes. They can go to 10-digit. And they specifically detail what a product is when it's being shipped. And we see across the board, the HS codes that these defense companies are reporting have almost no relation to what they're actually writing into the goods description space. And so a lot of it has gone undetected. And also, China stopped reporting its trade data. And so that made it really difficult to detect too. Our methodology harmonizes all of this trade data. So essentially, we're creating a mirror of Chinese exports by just looking at Russian imports and other countries globally. And that allows us to get a broader picture. I'm curious to see how it will continue. One thing that I will also add on that is that we always recommend, if doing similar analysis, to just use free text search for these descriptions. And that's how we find so many dual use goods in local languages, instead of just relying on the reported HS codes, which are pretty much always obfuscated.
Well, obviously, this is a very important issue for Ukraine as well, as clipping this supply of military-grade equipment to Russia. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky lately encouraging Western nations to really tighten sanctions regimes and to closely monitor the supplies moving into Russia. I think we have a soundbite from him. If we could play that real quick.
The common task for the European Union is to reduce Russia's ability to bypass sanctions. The sooner this is achieved, the closer we'll get to the defeat of Russia's aggression. We've noticed that the pace of sanctions has slowed down a bit, while the terrorist state is adapting faster to sanctions. It's worth catching up and fixing it. We believe we can do it.
Варто це виправити. Ми віримо, що ми це з вами зможемо.
All right, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky there on the significance, the importance of identifying those sanctions skirters. Naomi, final question to you. You spend your days combing through this data, trying to find these companies, identify them. What is your conclusion about the difficulty of identifying and drawing conclusions about sanctions busters? Is it an incredibly difficult process, or is it surprisingly, I don't want to say easy, but is it possible?
It's possible. It's possible, and that's what we're here to provide. My work now mostly focuses on getting all of our trade records together into one place. I am on our data team, so I focus on having these all in one searchable data set in multiple different languages so that we can offer the public this information. So while historically it's been really complex, talk to us. We're really happy to help.
All right, with that, we will say a big thank you to Naomi Garcia from the nonprofit C4ADS in Washington, D.C. And thanks so much to you, our viewers, for watching. If you've enjoyed this, check out one of our other DW Business specials on YouTube under the DW News channel. We'll see you over there.